Today we are finally going to start object-oriented programming in Python. There's so much stuff to give you just to start writing a program that's object-oriented that I want to kind of work through it a little bit conceptually first. So we will write some code, but we're not going to have anything to run for a little bit. So we're going to start with an example that mirrors the Byte of Python text online, and that's to create a class for robots. So remember back to lectures a couple weeks ago, a class is basically a category of things, and so you can define a class for whatever you want. It could be something like a robot or a car, but it could be something like a game or a player in a game. Inside that class, you can have properties, so attributes of each individual. You can have attributes of the class as a whole, and then you have things that members of the class can do. An instance of the class is basically one particular specific object that's a member of that category. So if we have a class of robots, a particular robot would be an instance of the robot class. To write code that does this, we first have to define what the class is. So we use the word class, and we're going to call ours robot. And then you put a colon after that, and we're going to put all the stuff about the class on the inside. For now, we're just going to put the word pass in there, which basically means don't do anything. We have this empty, but if we just left it empty, we would get a syntax error. So that sort of means we're intentionally leaving this blank. Then if we want to create an instance of our class, we could give it a variable name, and then we use the name of the class with parentheses. This is basically creating an instance of the class here. Now, if we try to run this, nothing happens, but we're not getting any errors. And if we were to try to print that variable, and now we run it, we can see what it prints out is that we have a robot object, and then it's got some stuff around that. But so it knows that we have a robot object. And this is text that we have seen in previous lectures when we try to print more complicated objects. So that's good, and that's working. But it's not very interesting at this point. We've just been able to name this variable. It doesn't do anything. We can't print it. It doesn't store anything. It's kind of useless at this point. And so what we want to do is start adding in information about what our robots can do and what do we know about them. So the first thing that we have to do is create a function inside the robot class. So this is a thing that robots can do, but it's a special function called init. So we use def to define a function like we do with any kind of function. And then init has two underscores, the word init for initialize, and then two underscores again. So this is special reserved syntax. And this is the function that automatically is going to get called when you try to create an instance like this. So you wouldn't have to do robot and then say go do the init function. The init function automatically gets executed when you try to make a new instance of the class. The arguments for init, you can only have one init function, but you can put whatever arguments you want in there. The simplest version has to use this other new thing called self. So self is basically the way that an instance of the class refers to itself. So if I want to know my name or my height or my age, I basically say, what is the age of myself or the name of myself? So it's a special reserved word that's used by an instance to talk about itself. I had a really hard time with this idea when I started programming. So there's stuff in the text that you can read about that, and hopefully as you see a bunch of examples, it'll become clear for you. But as always, if you have questions when you're working through this, you can send me an email and I'll try to explain better. It's a tricky-ish kind of concept, and like I said, one that I know I struggled with for a long time. So we're defining this special function init. It always has to have at least self as the first argument. We'll see in a minute how to add more arguments. And then inside this function, which itself is inside the robot class, we can put some steps that have to happen. So for now, we're just going to print creating new robot. So we're not going to change any of the rest of the code. We're still going to just leave our line here that creates a new robot object, and we'll go ahead and leave the line that prints it out, though that's not going to change. It's still going to tell us that we just have a robot object. But what we should see is that the init function executes when we create a new robot, even though we haven't added any special code to call that. By initializing a robot this way, or any class this way, the init function automatically gets executed. So we'll be able to see that because creating new robot will print out. So if we run it again, here we see our line, creating new robot, so we know the init function got called, and then our object is printing out. Now, let's make this a little more sophisticated. We're going to actually have some attributes of our robots. So, for example, they might have a name. So to do that, we are going to have to pass in an argument, and we're going to have to be able to accept that argument in the init function. So let's say we're going to take in a name, and then we're going to have a variable called my name equals name. So name is the argument, the variable name for the argument, and my name is going to be an attribute of our specific robot. So any robot that gets initialized is going to have its own name that's set equal to whatever we create. Now, if we tried to run it just like this, we're going to get an error because we haven't actually passed a name in to init. We're just calling the function to construct a new robot, but we're not passing a name. And so it's going to say, try to look for an init function that doesn't take any arguments except self, because there's nothing in here, and it won't be able to find that. So just to see what that error looks like, because it's an error you might get, it says init is missing one required positional argument, name. And so it's a complicated looking message, but it's a correct message that it's missing an argument. So to do that, we're actually going to put the name here as an argument. Okay, so now we're passing in this string. That's going to be the name. And if we go ahead and just save it like this, the error should go away, but we won't really see the name. So it says the same thing, creating new robot, and then it prints our robot object. Let's now see one new piece of syntax to show us how we can get that name back. So we've called the variable myName inside the class that is going to store the name of our robot. So if we want to print that name, when we're using the variable that we created down here, so here we've created an instance of the robot class, we've initialized it with the name C3PO, and if we want to see that name, when we use that variable down here, we use the name of the variable dot myName, which matches the variable name up here. We've seen things like this before. You've used this dot before to see different properties of things like strings or other elements, lists, for example. So this is a version of that. So you have C3PO.myName is what we're going to print out. So it will still print creating new robot, and then afterwards, instead of printing the object, it's going to print the name if we've done everything right. So if we flip over to run this, okay, so we do have an error here. And this is a more complex error than it should be. So I've done my name equals name here, but I forgot the most important part, which is self.myName equals name. If I don't use the self, then what I've essentially done is created a new variable inside this function that I set equal to name, and then it goes away. If I want that variable to stay associated with this particular object that I'm creating, this instance of the robot class, I have to attach it to myself. So for myself, my name is equal to name. If you leave it off, then it's just a regular old variable that's not attached to the object, and it goes away when the init function is done. So that's a big thing to pay attention to. Anything that you want to associate to the particular object uses self dot and then the variable name afterwards. So this we don't have to change because I'm still saying here's my robot instance, and then I want to get my name from it. But setting it equal there is going to fix that error. So let's try that one more time. Okay, so we got that to work. So it says creating new robot, And now it actually prints the name for us with that print statement. So to go over all the stuff we learned, this is like a short little program, but a ton of new material. Classes, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, are categories of things. To create one, you use the special keyword class, and then you come up with a name for your class that should describe whatever that general category is. In this case, we're talking about robots. Inside the class, you can add functions, and the one that you need to create is the init function. This is the function that automatically gets called whenever you create an object or an instance of this class. The simplest way to do init just has self as the argument. And remember that self is a special reserved keyword that refers to the instance that you're creating. But you can add in other arguments to the init function. Again, just in case it's not clear here, init is 2 underscores and then the word init and then 2 more underscores. You can only have one of these. So you can't have like 2 init functions. In some programming languages you can, but in Python you can only have one. Inside, you can give regular commands like print statements. And you can also, this is where you can associate attributes with your instance. So in this case, we're saying whenever we create a robot, it's going to look at itself and say that its name stored in the variable my name is equal to whatever we pass in that name argument. Then, if we want to create an instance of the class, we give a regular variable name, and we set that equal to the name of the class and then parentheses. If we leave those parentheses empty, it means the init function should only have self as an argument. If we have any arguments in there, those are going to be the arguments that come after self. So here it looks like there's kind of 2 arguments to init, but we only pass 1 because self is automatically passed. So that's going to construct a new robot or create a new robot for us. And then if we want to use some of those attributes or variables that we've attached to instances of the class, like we did here with my name, we use the variable that we created that's an instance of that class dot the name of the attribute that we used with self in the constructor. So almost every line here has something new. We're just going to do a lot of practice in subsequent videos, but these are the very fundamentals of how you start doing object-oriented programming in Python.